I found my grandmother's will tucked inside an old cookbook 2 weeks after her funeral, and that single piece of paper changed everything I thought I knew about my family's property in Lake Forest, Illinois. My name is Quinton Bradford, and I had just turned 32 when Grandma Alois passed away quietly in her sleep. She had been the rock of our family, a sharp-minded woman who remembered everything from her childhood during the Depression to the exact recipe for her famous apple strudel. What I didn't know was that she had been keeping a secret that would turn into the legal battle of my life. The will was dated from 1985, just a year after my grandfather had died. In it, she explicitly stated that the 2-acre parcel of land behind her primary residence on Woodland Drive was to remain in the family, never to be sold or transferred to any outside entity. The thing was, for the past 40 years, the Woodland Estates Homeowners Association had been using that exact piece of land as their community recreation area, complete with a playground, tennis courts, and a small pavilion where they held their insufferable monthly meetings. I had grown up playing on that playground, never once questioning who actually owned it. My parents had been members of the HOA for decades, paying their dues like clockwork. Everyone in the neighborhood simply assumed the land belonged to the association. But according to the will and the property deed I found in the same wooden box, my grandmother had never sold or donated that land to anyone. The next morning, I drove back to Grandma's house with the documents spread across my passenger seat. The house itself was a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and blue shutters, sitting on about half an acre. But behind it, separated by a line of old oak trees, was the recreation area I had always known as HOA property. I parked in the driveway and walked around back, my boots crunching through the early October leaves, standing there, looking at the tennis courts where I had learned to serve when I was 12. I felt a strange mix of emotions. This was my inheritance, but it was also 40 years of community memories. Kids were playing on the swings, their laughter carrying across the crisp autumn air. A couple in their 60s was playing doubles on the far court. Everything looked so normal, so established. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Marcus, who worked as a paralegal in downtown Chicago. "Marcus, I need a property lawyer. Like yesterday." "What's going on, Q?" His voice carried that familiar concern we had developed over 15 years of friendship. "Remember my grandma's place?" Turns out she owned the land the HOA has been using since the 80s, and nobody ever paid her a dime for it. There was a long pause. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. I have the deed right here." "Okay, don't talk to anyone yet. Let me make some calls." I know a guy who specializes in property disputes. His name is David Chen, and he's ruthless in the best possible way. 3 days later, I sat in David Chen's office on West Monroe Street. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and an intensity that made me believe Marcus's description. His office walls were covered with framed case victories, and I noticed more than a few involved HOAs. "Mr. Bradford, what you have here is extraordinary," David said, reviewing the documents I had brought. "This deed is clear and undisputed. Your grandmother owned that land outright. The HOA has been trespassing for 4 decades. But how did this even happen?" I asked. "Wouldn't someone have noticed?" David leaned back in his leather chair. "It happens more often than you'd think. Someone in the HOA probably assumed they had permission, or maybe they thought the land was part of the common area when the association was formed. Over time, the assumption became accepted fact, but assumption doesn't equal ownership. So what do? First, we send them a cease and desist letter, then we file for retroactive rental payments. Illinois law allows us to seek compensation for unauthorized use of private property. 40 years at fair market rental value for 2 acres in Lake Forest. We're talking serious money. My stomach flipped. How much money? David's fingers flew across his calculator. Conservative estimate, between $800,000 and $1.2 million. Possibly more if we can prove they've generated revenue from events held on the property. I must have looked pale because David pushed a glass of water across his desk. This is going to get ugly, Quinton. HOAs don't like being told they're wrong, and they definitely don't like paying out large sums. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my grandmother, about how she had worked 2 jobs after Grandpa died to keep that house and land in the family. About how she had explicitly written in her will that it should never leave our possession. Yes, I'm prepared. The cease and desist letter was delivered to the Woodland Estates HOA board on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. Finally, I answered. Hello, is this Quinton Bradford? The voice was sharp, nasal, and dripping with barely contained anger. Speaking. This is Sharon Whitmore, president of the Woodland Estates Homeowners Association. I just received the most absurd letter from some lawyer claiming you own our community recreation area. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but it's not a scam, Sharon. My grandmother owned that land. She never sold it or gave permission for its use. That's ridiculous. That property has been part of this community for 40 years. Everyone knows it belongs to the association. Everyone was wrong, I said calmly. I have the deed. The property records are public. You can verify it yourself. Well, we're not going to just roll over because you found some old paperwork. We have rights. Adverse possession. I had already discussed this with David. In Illinois, adverse possession requires exclusive possession for 20 years. But it also requires that the possession be hostile and without permission. If you can prove you were using the land openly and my grandmother knew about it but never objected, you might have a case. But that still doesn't help you with the first 20 years. Sharon's breathing was audible. You're trying to destroy this community. Your own grandmother was part of this neighborhood. She would be ashamed of you. That stung, but I kept my voice level. My grandmother left explicit instructions in her will. I'm following them. If the HOA wants to discuss reasonable compensation, my lawyer is available. We'll see you in court. She hung up with enough force that I imagined her phone cracking. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. I started receiving letters from other HOA members, some pleading, some threatening. A woman named Patricia left a note on my car windshield calling me a greedy vulture. Someone else suggested I was dishonoring my grandmother's memory. The local Facebook group for Woodland Estates turned into a war zone, with people I had known my entire life calling me everything from a con artist to a psychopath. But not everyone was against me. My parents, who still lived in the neighborhood, stood firmly by my side. My dad, Robert, was a retired accountant who had always been meticulous about records. He started digging through old financial statements and discovered something interesting. Quinton, come look at this, he said one evening at their kitchen table. Spread before him were decades of HOA financial reports. They've been charging residents fees for maintenance of the recreation area. Look here. In 2018, they collected a special assessment of $200 per household for tennis court resurfacing. There are 150 homes in Woodland Estates. I did the math. $30,000 just for that one project. Right. And look at this, they rent out the pavilion for private events, weddings, birthday parties, you name it. They charged the Hendersons $1,500 for their daughter's wedding reception last summer. David Chen practically salivated when I showed him these documents. This is perfect. They've been profiting from your grandmother's land. This strengthens our case significantly. The HOA responded to our initial demand with their own letter, drafted by a law firm called Peterson and Associates. Their position was that they had acquired the land through adverse possession, and that any claim from the Bradford family was 40 years too late. They accused me of elder abuse, suggesting I had manipulated my grandmother into changing her will, despite the will being dated when I was only 2 years old. David filed our lawsuit in the Circuit Court of Lake County on November 10th. We were suing for 4 things: trespass, unjust enrichment, declaratory judgment confirming ownership, and monetary damages for 40 years of unauthorized use. The amount we listed was $1.3 million. The news spread through Lake Forest like wildfire. Local reporters picked up the story, and suddenly, I was fielding calls from Chicago Tribune and WGN. I declined most interviews on David's advice, but the story ran anyway, with headlines like "Grandson Claims HOA Stole Family Land," and "Lake Forest Land Dispute Could Cost HOA Over $1 million." The preliminary hearing was set for January 15th. In the meantime, the HOA hired a more aggressive legal team, led by a woman named Margaret Holloway, who had a reputation for crushing property disputes. She was in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a courtroom manner that could peel paint. David seemed unfazed. "I've dealt with Margaret before. She's good, but she relies on intimidation. The facts are on our side." The discovery phase was brutal. Both sides requested mountains of documents. I had to provide everything related to my grandmother's estate, finances, and communication. The HOA had to provide all records related to the land, including maintenance logs, financial statements, and meeting minutes going back to 1985. It was in those meeting minutes that we found gold. My dad was the one who spotted it, reading through page after page of old typed records that had been scanned and sent over. "Quinton, David, you need to see this. It's from April 1986, a board meeting." The minutes, typed on an old typewriter with uneven letters, contained a discussion about the recreation area. The then president, a man named Howard Wallace, had written, "Discussion regarding the use of the Bradford property for community purposes. Mrs. Alois Bradford has been approached about formalizing an arrangement but has declined. Board agrees to continue maintenance of the area and revisit the matter in the future." David's eyes lit up. They knew. They explicitly knew it was her property, and they knew she didn't agree to their use of it. "This destroys their adverse possession claim." "How?" I asked. "Adverse possession requires that the possession be hostile, meaning without permission, but it also has to be under a claim of right. This document shows they knew they didn't have a right to the property. They were consciously trespassing." We found 2 more references in later years, one from 1991 and another from 1997, where board members mentioned the Bradford property question, but decided to leave things as they were because Mrs. Bradford hasn't raised any objections. Margaret Holloway tried to have these documents excluded, arguing they were hearsay, but the judge ruled that corporate records were admissible under the business records exception. The January hearing was continued to March to allow both sides to complete discovery. Meanwhile, life in Woodland Estates became increasingly uncomfortable. Sharon Whitmore, the HOA president, started a petition to have my parents removed from the board of the Neighborhood Watch, claiming a conflict of interest. Someone spray-painted "thief" on my grandmother's garage door. My mom called me in tears. "I don't want you to drop the case," she said, her voice wavering. "But this is getting scary, honey. People we've known for 25 years won't even look at us at the grocery store." "Did you file a police report about the vandalism?" I asked. "Your father is handling it. The Lake Forest police are investigating, but nobody saw anything, of course." I felt a surge of anger. These people are acting like we're the villains. The HOA has been stealing from Grandma for 40 years, and somehow we're the bad guys. "I know. I just wanted you to know what's happening. Be careful, Quinton. Sharon Whitmore is telling people you're trying to take away the children's playground out of pure greed." That last part bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had never intended to displace anyone or take away community resources. I just wanted what was rightfully my family's property and fair compensation for its use. David suggested we make a settlement offer to show good faith. We proposed that the HOA could purchase the land for its current appraised value of $400,000, and we would reduce our claim for back rent to $400,000 for a total settlement of $800,000. We also offered to accept payment over 10 years with reasonable interest. The HOA rejected it within 2 days. Their counter-offer was insulting: $50,000 as a goodwill gesture in exchange for me signing over the deed and releasing all claims. Margaret Holloway's cover letter suggested that if we went to trial, they would pursue sanctions against me and David for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. "So much for settlement," David said, tossing the letter aside. "Let's go to trial." The trial began on March 23rd, a cold Tuesday morning with sleet falling from a gray sky. The courtroom was packed. It seemed like half of Woodland Estates had shown up, along with curious locals and a few reporters. Judge Raymond Porter presided, a no-nonsense man in his early 60s known for running an efficient courtroom. David's opening statement was clear and methodical. He laid out the chain of title, showing that my great-grandfather had purchased the land in 1952, that it had passed to my grandfather, then to my grandmother, and finally to me. He presented the deed, the will, and the property surveys. Then he showed the HOA meeting minutes that proved they had known all along they didn't own the land. "This is not a case of innocent mistake," David told the jury of 8 Lake County residents. "This is a case of conscious, deliberate appropriation of private property for commercial purposes. The defendant has profited from Mr. Bradford's land for 4 decades without paying a single dollar in rent. The law calls this unjust enrichment, and justice requires that they be held accountable." Margaret Holloway's opening was all emotional appeal. She talked about community, about children playing, about families gathering for 4th of July picnics. She painted me as a greedy outsider trying to destroy a beloved neighborhood institution. She argued that even if the original use of the land was questionable, 40 years of open and notorious possession meant the HOA had acquired ownership through adverse possession. "Quinton Bradford doesn't even live in this community," she said, gesturing toward me. "He's a software developer from Chicago who sees dollar signs where his neighbors see their children's playground." Alois Bradford never objected to the community's use of this land. She attended events there. She watched her grandchildren play there. To claim now that this was all theft is revisionist history at its worst. The trial lasted 8 days. We called a surveyor who confirmed the exact boundaries of my grandmother's property. We called a real estate appraiser who testified that fair market rental value for the land over 40 years, accounting for inflation, and the improvements made, totaled approximately $1.1 million. We called my father, who testified about my grandmother's character and her explicit wishes as stated in her will. The most powerful moment came when David introduced a letter my grandmother had written to the HOA in 1989. We had found it in her files, a carbon copy on thin, yellowed paper. In it, she politely but firmly stated that while she didn't mind children playing on her land, she could not transfer ownership of it because she had promised her late husband it would stay in the family. The fact that she didn't physically expel them doesn't mean she gave permission, David argued. She was an elderly widow living alone. The HOA board members were her neighbors. She took a gentle approach, but she never relinquished her rights. Margaret's case relied heavily on the adverse possession claim. She called several long-time residents who testified they had always believed the recreation area belonged to the HOA. She called the current HOA treasurer, a nervous man named Tom Gerard, who explained how much the community relied on the space and how devastating it would be to lose it. But under cross-examination, Tom admitted that he had been aware of questions about the property's ownership. It was something that came up occasionally in board meetings, he conceded. But we always just figured Mrs. Bradford was okay with it since she never sued us. David pounced. So you knew there was a question about ownership, but you never took steps to formally acquire the property or negotiate a lease. We discussed it, but it never seemed urgent. And during those discussions, did anyone suggest you should pay Mrs. Bradford rent? Tom shifted uncomfortably. I don't recall that being proposed. So you knew you might not own the land, but you charged residents fees for maintaining it and rented it out for private events anyway. We were acting in the community's best interest, while pocketing the profits from someone else's property. Margaret objected, and Judge Porter sustained it, but the point was made. The HOA's adverse possession claim fell apart under scrutiny. David systematically dismantled each required element. Yes, the possession had been open and notorious, but no, it had not been hostile under a claim of right because the HOA's own records showed they knew they didn't own it. The possession had not been exclusive because my grandmother had retained access and occasionally used the land herself. And critically, under Illinois law, adverse possession requires not just 20 years of possession, but 20 years of paying property taxes on the land. Did the Woodland Estates HOA ever pay property taxes on this 2-acre parcel? David asked their expert witness, a real estate attorney named Douglas Finn. No, but they weren't required to as a homeowners association. So they didn't pay taxes. Who did? According to the tax records, Alois Bradford continued to pay taxes on the entire parcel, including the 2 acres, until her death. Let me make sure the jury understands this. Mrs. Bradford paid property taxes on this land for 40 years while the HOA used it, improved it, and profited from it, but never offered to compensate her or take over the tax burden. Douglas looked uncomfortable. That appears to be correct. On the 8th day, both sides gave closing arguments. Margaret made an impassioned plea about community values and the unfairness of retroactive claims. David countered with cold, hard facts and the law. The defendant wants you to believe this is about preserving a playground, David said, but it's really about accountability. They took something that didn't belong to them. They knew it didn't belong to them, and they profited from it. Now, when faced with the consequences of their actions, they're wrapping themselves in the flag of community values. Don't let emotion distract you from the facts. The facts are simple. This is Mr. Bradford's land, and the HOA owes him for 40 years of use. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I sat in a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom, unable to eat, barely able to think. My parents were there, along with David and his associate, Jennifer. We made small talk, but mostly we just waited, Finally, the bailiff called us back. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone filed in. Judge Porter took his seat, and the jury foreman, a middle-aged black woman who worked as a school administrator, stood with the verdict form. In the matter of Bradford v. Woodland Estates Homeowners Association, we the jury find in favor of the plaintiff, Quinton Bradford, on all counts. Relief washed over me, but the foreman wasn't finished. We find that the defendant knowingly trespassed on the plaintiff's property for a period of 40 years. We find that the defendant was unjustly enriched through their unauthorized use of said property. We award the plaintiff compensatory damages in the amount of $1,100,000. The courtroom erupted. Sharon Whitmore stood up, shouting something about an appeal. Judge Porter banged his gavel, calling for order. Margaret Holloway's face was stone, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. David squeezed my shoulder, grinning, but the foreman held up her hand. We're not finished. We also find that the defendant's conduct was willful and wanton, and we award punitive damages in the amount of $200,000. Now, it was my turn to be shocked. The total judgment was $1.3 million. Plus, under Illinois law, the defendant would have to pay my attorney's fees, which were substantial. As people filed out of the courtroom, I heard the whispers and saw the angry stares. But I also saw a few people, older residents who had known my grandmother well, give me small nods of acknowledgement. Outside, David briefed me on what came next. They'll almost certainly appeal, but that judgment is solid. I don't see an appellate court overturning it. More likely, they'll try to negotiate a settlement before the appeal is fully briefed. He was right. 3 weeks later, Margaret Holloway called David with a settlement offer. The HOA would pay $1 million total, give me clear title to the land with no strings attached, and I would waive the punitive damages and attorney's fees. They wanted to avoid both the appeal and the potential for attorney's fees that could add another $200,000 to their bill. David and I discussed it at length. An appeal could take 2 years or more. Even if we won, collecting the judgment from an HOA with limited assets might be difficult. The settlement gave me a 7-figure payout and clear title immediately. Take it, my father advised. You've proven your point. You've vindicated your grandmother's memory. The money will secure your future. Don't drag this out for spite. I agreed to the settlement on one condition. The HOA had to issue a public statement acknowledging that they had wrongfully used the Bradford family's property, and that Alois Bradford had been correct in her assertion of ownership all along. Margaret initially balked, but eventually agreed. The statement appeared in the Lake Forest Gazette and was read at the next HOA meeting. Sharon Whitmore resigned as president a week later, claiming health reasons, though everyone knew the real reason. The HOA had to take out a substantial loan to pay the settlement, secured against their reserve funds and a special assessment on all members. The reaction in Woodland Estates was mixed. Some residents understood and even apologized to my parents. Others remained bitter. The Hendersons, whose daughter had gotten married at the pavilion, sent me a handwritten note saying they understood I was standing up for my rights. Patricia, the woman who had called me a vulture, moved to Wisconsin. As for the land itself, I faced a decision. Part of me wanted to sell it to a developer just to spite the HOA. But that wasn't who I was, and it wasn't what my grandmother would have wanted. After thinking it over for several weeks, I approached the HOA with an offer. I proposed donating the land to the community with several conditions. First, it would be placed in a permanent conservation trust, ensuring it could never be sold or commercially developed. Second, a plaque would be installed acknowledging that the land was a gift from the Bradford family. Third, the HOA would establish a scholarship fund in Alois Bradford's name, funded annually from a portion of dues, to help local students pursue higher education. The new HOA president, a reasonable man named Gary Mitchell, accepted immediately. The paperwork was finalized in July. On a warm Saturday morning in August, the entire community gathered for the dedication ceremony. My parents were there, along with several of my grandmother's old friends from the neighborhood book club. Gary gave a speech about community, healing, and the importance of integrity. Then I spoke, keeping it brief. My grandmother loved this neighborhood. She loved seeing children play and families gather. She never wanted to deprive anyone of those joys. But she also believed in principle, in standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. This land is my gift to the community in her memory. I hope it serves families for generations to come. The plaque was beautiful, mounted on a stone marker near the pavilion. This land is dedicated to the memory of Alois Bradford, who cherished community, family, and integrity. Donated by her grandson, Quinton Bradford, 2026. After the ceremony, people approached me tentatively. Some apologized for their harsh words during the lawsuit. Others thanked me for not selling the land. A few still kept their distance, but I could live with that. Sharon Whitmore was notably absent, though I heard she had moved to Arizona to be near her daughter. The scholarship fund was established with an initial contribution of $50,000 from the settlement money I donated back. The first recipient was a young woman named Emily who planned to study environmental science at Northwestern. At the award ceremony, her parents thanked me with tears in their eyes. "This means everything to our family," her father said. "Emily is the first in our family to go to college." My grandmother would have loved that. The $1.3 million settlement transformed my life in practical ways, too. I paid off my student loans, invested wisely, and bought a house in Evanston, close enough to visit my parents regularly but far enough to avoid the lingering awkwardness in Woodland Estates. I also kept working. The software company I worked for was developing educational tools, and the work felt meaningful. About 6 months after the settlement, I received a call from an attorney representing 3 other families in suburban Chicago. They had similar situations. HOAs using private property without permission, assuming ownership through decades of unchallenged use. Word of my case had spread, and these families wanted to know if I would share my experience and documentation. I connected them with David Chen, who took on 2 of the cases. Both settled before trial, with the HOAs paying substantial sums rather than risk a verdict like mine. David told me that my case had created precedent that was making HOAs across Illinois review their property boundaries more carefully. "You didn't just win your case," he said over lunch in Chicago one afternoon. "You've changed how these associations operate. They can't just assume anymore. They have to verify ownership and get proper agreements in writing." That felt good, like my grandmother's ordeal had served a larger purpose. My parents continued living in Woodland Estates, and gradually the tension eased. The new HOA board was more transparent and professional. Gary Mitchell proved to be a capable leader who focused on genuine community building rather than petty power games. The recreation area was better maintained than ever, and the scholarship fund grew each year. On the 2-year anniversary of my grandmother's death, I visited her grave at Lake Forest Cemetery. The spring flowers were blooming, and the morning sun filtered through the old oak trees. I sat on the bench near her headstone and told her about everything that had happened. "I hope I did right by you, Grandma," I said quietly. "I know it got messy, and I know some people still think I was wrong, but you taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. especially when it's hard. A breeze rustled through the leaves and I could almost hear her voice, strong and sure. "You did good, Quinton. You did real good." I thought about the journey from finding that will in her cookbook to standing here now. The anger, the accusations, the courtroom battles, the eventual resolution. It had been exhausting and painful, but also clarifying. I had learned that doing the right thing often means enduring criticism from people who are more comfortable with convenient fictions than uncomfortable truths. The HOA had operated for 40 years on an assumption that nobody questioned, because questioning it was inconvenient. They had built a whole system on land that wasn't theirs, convinced themselves of their righteousness, and attacked anyone who threatened their comfortable illusion. But property rights matter, integrity matters, and sometimes holding people accountable for their actions even decades later is the most important thing you can do. As I left the cemetery that morning, I passed by Woodland Drive. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost idyllic. Children were already out playing on the recreation area, despite the early hour. A group of women were setting up for what looked like a community yard sale at the pavilion. Life went on, as it always does, but now it went on with truth as its foundation instead of a convenient lie. The land that had been taken was acknowledged, paid for, and ultimately gifted back through proper channels. The community had faced an uncomfortable reckoning with its past and emerged stronger for it. And my grandmother's name lived on, not just on a plaque, but in the scholarship that would help young people for generations. I drove back to Evanston, thinking about legacy. My grandmother had left me more than land. She had left me an example of principle. She had quietly paid taxes on property the HOA was using, never making a fuss, but also never surrendering her rights. She had written her wishes clearly in her will, trusting that someday, someone would honor them. I had been that someone. And though the path had been difficult, I wouldn't change a thing. The settlement money allowed me to establish my own charitable foundation, focused on supporting families in property disputes with larger entities. I had learned how expensive and intimidating legal battles could be, and I wanted to help others who found themselves in similar situations, but lacked the resources to fight back. The Bradford Property Rights Foundation provided grants for legal fees and connected families with experienced attorneys like David. Our first case involved a widow in Naperville, whose HOA was trying to force her to tear down a garden shed that had been on her property since before the HOA existed. With our support, she successfully defended her rights, and the HOA was forced to update their records. It was a small victory, but it meant everything to her. "You gave me hope," she told me at a foundation event. "I thought I was crazy, that maybe they were right and I was just a difficult old woman. But you showed me that standing up for yourself isn't wrong." These moments made everything worthwhile: the stress, the conflict, the temporary ostracism. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept. It was real people being treated fairly, having their rights respected, living with dignity. 3 years after my grandmother's death, the Lake Forest community held a memorial service for all residents who had passed away that year. It was an annual tradition, and my mother had encouraged me to attend. I was hesitant, unsure of my reception, but I went anyway. To my surprise, the program included a special tribute to my grandmother. Gary Mitchell spoke about her decades of community involvement, her kindness to neighbors, and her quiet strength. Then he addressed the elephant in the room. "Many of us remember the difficulties surrounding the Bradford property dispute," he said carefully. "It was a painful time for our community. But looking back now, with perspective and honesty, we can acknowledge that it was also necessary. Eloise Bradford was right. Her family was right. And this community is better for having confronted that truth, however uncomfortable it was. He paused, letting that sink in. The Bradford Recreation Area and Scholarship Fund stand as testimony to the power of integrity and reconciliation. We honor Alois Bradford today not just for her years of service, but for the values she instilled in her family and, ultimately, in all of us. The applause was genuine and sustained. Afterward, dozens of people approached me, many apologizing for their behavior during the lawsuit, others simply expressing appreciation for how I had handled the resolution. One conversation stuck with me particularly. An older man named Frank, who had been vocal in his criticism of me during the trial, shook my hand firmly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I called you some pretty ugly names, said you were destroying the neighborhood. But my granddaughter just got the Bradford Scholarship, and watching her face light up when she found out, I realized you gave us something better than what we had before. You gave us the truth, and then you gave us grace. Thank you, Frank. That means a lot. Your grandma raised your parents right, and they raised you right. That's the real legacy." Driving home that evening, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The vindication wasn't just legal or financial anymore. It was personal and communal. The neighborhood had healed, or at least begun to heal, and my family's reputation had been restored. I thought about Sharon Whitmore occasionally, wondering if she had ever come to terms with what happened. The HOA's insurance had covered most of the settlement, but her leadership during the crisis had been disastrous. She had chosen confrontation over negotiation, denial over acknowledgement. In many ways, she was a cautionary tale about the dangers of entrenched power and unchecked authority. HOAs serve important functions when run properly, but they can also become little fiefdoms where board members wield disproportionate power with minimal oversight. My case had shone a spotlight on those dynamics, and I heard from multiple sources that HOAs throughout the region had reformed their practices. As a result, some implemented independent audits. Others required legal review of property boundaries and usage rights. A few even established ombudsman positions to handle disputes before they escalated to lawsuits. These were small changes, but collectively, they represented a shift toward greater accountability. The legal community took notice too. David Chen was invited to speak at the Illinois State Bar Association about property rights and HOA disputes. The case was written up in legal journals as an example of successful litigation against institutional defendants. Law schools used it as a teaching tool for property law courses. All of this from one old deed, and a grandmother who refused to surrender what was rightfully hers, even when it would have been easier to just let it go. On what would have been my grandmother's 85th birthday, I organized a small gathering at the recreation area. My parents came, along with several of Grandma's old friends and some younger families who had benefited from the scholarship fund. We planted a cherry tree near the playground, her favorite type of tree, and shared stories about her life. My father spoke about her resilience during the Depression, how she had learned to make something from nothing and never complained. My mother shared funny memories of Grandma's stubborn streak, how she would dig in her heels when she knew she was right. Emily, the first scholarship recipient, talked about how the financial support had changed her life trajectory. Then it was my turn. I kept it simple. Grandma Alois taught me that property rights aren't just about money or legal technicalities. They're about dignity, about having control over your own life and choices. When someone takes what's yours without permission, even if they think they have good reasons, they're taking away a piece of your autonomy. Fighting for this land wasn't about being greedy or vindictive. It was about honoring her autonomy and her explicit wishes. It was about saying that principles matter, even 40 years later. I looked around at the families playing, the children laughing, the community thriving on land that now properly belonged to them through legitimate donation rather than unauthorized taking. And I think she'd be proud that we found a way to honor both her principles and her love for this community. The cherry tree flourished over the following months, its white blossoms appearing each spring as a living memorial. Children climbed its lower branches, and families took photos beneath its canopy. It became a beloved feature of the park, a symbol of both the conflict that had nearly torn the community apart and the healing that followed. As for me, I continued my work at the software company while devoting more time to the Bradford Foundation. We helped dozens of families navigate property disputes, sometimes through litigation, but more often through negotiation and education. I discovered that I had a knack for seeing both sides of these conflicts and finding middle ground where possible. Not every case ended as well as mine. Some families lost their claims due to legitimate adverse possession or clerical errors in old deeds. Others won legal victories, but faced such community backlash that they moved away. A few settled for less than they deserved because they couldn't afford prolonged litigation. But many found resolution, justice, and peace. That made the foundation's work worthwhile. My grandmother's ordeal had created something larger than herself, a legacy that extended far beyond one neighborhood in Lake Forest. Years passed. The Bradford Scholarship Fund grew substantially, eventually funding 3 full scholarships annually. The recreation area was renovated, with new playground equipment and resurfaced tennis courts paid for through properly authorized HOA assessments. My parents aged gracefully, eventually selling their house in Woodland Estates and moving to a retirement community in nearby Highland Park. I married a brilliant woman named Victoria Sterling, an environmental lawyer I met at a foundation fundraiser. She understood the passion I felt for property rights and justice, and she brought her own commitment to protecting natural spaces. We bought a house in Lake Forest, not in Woodland Estates, but close enough to visit the recreation area regularly. When our daughter was born, we named her Alois. I took her to visit the park for the first time when she was 3 months old, carrying her in my arms as I showed her the plaque, the cherry tree, and the playground where I had played as a child, and where her great-great-grandmother's principled stand had transformed a community. "This is part of your heritage," I told her, knowing she couldn't understand yet but wanting to say it anyway. "Your great-great-grandma believed in standing up for what's right, even when it cost her something, even when people didn't understand, and because she did, all of this exists." The park, the scholarships, the lessons this community learned about integrity. Little Alois gurgled and grabbed at the cherry blossoms, and I felt the weight of generations, the continuum of values passed down through time. My grandmother had given me more than land or money. She had given me a moral compass, a sense of what matters, a willingness to fight for principle even when it's hard. And I would pass those same things on to my daughter, just as my parents had passed them to me. The story could have ended so differently. If I hadn't found that will, if I hadn't pursued the case, if I had accepted one of the lowball settlement offers, if I had sold the land to a developer out of spite, or if I had simply let the HOA continue their unauthorized use for the sake of avoiding conflict. Any of those choices would have been easier in the moment, but would have betrayed something fundamental. Instead, I had chosen the hard path. And in doing so, I had honored my grandmother's memory, secured justice for 40 years of wrongful taking, transformed a community's understanding of property rights and accountability, established a scholarship that would help young people for generations, and created a foundation that would assist other families facing similar battles. The financial settlement had been substantial, but the real victory was intangible. The restoration of truth, the vindication of principle, and the demonstration that standing up to institutional power is possible and worthwhile. As I write this now, more than a decade after finding that will in my grandmother's cookbook, I can say with certainty that I made the right choice. The journey was difficult, the conflict was painful, and the temporary isolation was hard to bear. But justice was served. The law was upheld. And a community learned valuable lessons about respecting property rights and the importance of acting with integrity. The Bradford Recreation Area still serves families every day, but now it does so honestly, with proper title and acknowledgement of its history. The Scholarship Fund has sent over 30 students to college, many of them the first in their families to pursue higher education. The foundation has helped more than 100 families resolve property disputes. And somewhere, I like to think, my grandmother looks on approvingly, satisfied that her grandson did what needed to be done, that her principled stand was ultimately vindicated, and that her legacy extends far beyond the boundaries of 2 acres in Lake Forest, Illinois. She taught me that integrity isn't convenient, justice isn't easy, and doing the right thing often means standing alone for a while before others join you. Those lessons have shaped my life in countless ways, influencing my career choices, my approach to fatherhood, my marriage, and my sense of purpose. The HOA case wasn't just about money or property. It was about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of world I wanted to help create. A world where taking someone's property without permission has consequences, even 40 years later. A world where communities face uncomfortable truths instead of papering over them. A world where justice may be delayed but isn't ultimately denied. A world where one person's principled stand can transform not just their own life but the lives of hundreds of others. That's my grandmother's true legacy, and I'm honored to carry it forward.